All right, hey guys, I hope you guys watched that last video, and at this point you have a pretty good understanding of the reproductive tracts and the anatomy and the physiology that's going on there, and that you've taken that some time to write down those steps and go ahead and submit that before watching this video, because in this one we're going to move on to the next real piece of our reproductive unit. So we are going to be exploring today the cycle that a female would go through, that their anatomy would go through through reproduction, and just the way that the eggs drop and how all of that stuff happens. So there's quite a few different things that we need to understand, some terms that we need to understand before we really start talking about what's physically happening. So we're going to walk through this kind of step by step, and I have some little cards here I'm going to hold up, and we're going to talk about each of those things and then how they work together. So obviously, if a female is going to go through these steps, what is the very, very first thing that has to happen to them? They have to be born, right? A female can't go through these steps if they're not physically a thing. So your step one to the body developing and going through these different stages and cycles each month is, or each however amount of time, some different species are different, is that that female has to physically be born, right? So once that female is born, there's a stage of time that passes before it really enters its first true cycle. And that first thing is what we call puberty. So puberty is what we would call reproductive maturity. So it's at that point that a female would be able to be bred. It's at that point that a female, their reproductive tract would be mature enough to handle the semen being put into the uterus and that fertilization and being able to sustain that baby. So after a female is born, it has to, after a certain amount of time, it'll reach puberty, and that's when its reproductive tract is mature enough that it can start reproducing. This only happens once, okay? So once that female hits puberty, that puberty really marks the first day of what we call a female's estrus cycle. So the people who decided to name all these things are actually really tricky, and they decided to come up with two different words that mean two different things that are said exactly the same, because that makes a lot of sense. So there's two different versions of the word estrus. One is spelled E-S-T-R-U-S, and one is spelled E-S-T-R-O-U-S. And so an estrus cycle is that whole process of being in heat, being out of heat, being in heat, being out of heat. But depending on how you spell the word, they mean two different things. So for our purposes, I'm going to pronounce this one as estrus, and I'm going to pronounce this one as estrus, because if you notice there's an O in there, it's a longer word. Okay, so estrus starts the day that a female hits puberty, okay? And that's what we call, what we would refer to as the heat cycle. That's when we would say that an animal is in heat. That's when we would say that they're probably most likely to have eggs able to be fertilized, okay? Throughout that estrus, in that cycle, in relation to that cycle, is when ovulation would occur. Now, when we talked about anatomy and physiology, we talked about ovulation being the process of those eggs maturing and dropping from the ovary through the infundibulum, through the oviduct to the uterus. So those are the signs of heat, the signs of estrus are what we want to watch for when an animal's going into that, okay? Estrus is the amount of time that passes between each estrus cycle, okay? So if we talk through this just a little bit, because that's probably confusing, when an animal is born, they for a long time go through a maturing process. They hit puberty, which is that reproductive maturity, and that's the first day of their estrus cycle, okay? So that estrus cycle, that ovulation occurs, and estrus, when that cycle's over, estrus is the amount of time that passes before the next estrus cycle begins, okay? In humans, that cycle happens every 28 days. In some different animals, it could be 16, it could be 21, it could be all sorts of things. So this is the actual heat cycle itself. This is the amount of time that passes between those heat cycles, okay? During estrus, which we've talked about this with anatomy, something called ovulation occurs. Okay, so ovulation, I just realized that this is mirrored, so all of this stuff is probably backwards to you, but that's okay. Um, Ovulation is that idea of those eggs dropping from the ovary, and that is the time in which a female is most fertile. So you want to watch for those signs of heat within a female, because that's when you would want to breed them. Okay, signs of heat in an animal. There's a few of them, would be popping of the ears. So if a male, if sometimes different farms will use what's called like a teaser bore or a teaser bull. So they'll actually have their females in pens, and then they'll walk that boar or that bull past those females, and the hormones that are being let off from that male would stimulate that female, and make them know that a male is close, and they can kind of smell their scent and that maybe it's time to breed. So when that male is being walked past, if their ears pop, I want you to imagine like a dog when they smell your food, right? And their ears perk up and they're really excited. That's what's happening with these female animals. And that can be a sign that that animal is in heat. Another sign would be if they're what we call standing. So on pigs in particular, you can walk past and just lightly press on the crown of their back. And if they stop moving and they stand up real straight and real still, then that's what we call standing heat. So that would basically, they're feeling that pressure on their back, which is where they would feel pressure if the male were to mount, basically, in that reproduction, that process was happening. So if you push on the female's back and they stand up real still,